but I think it's relevant to the topic of this conference. And I'm not actually really an expert in Yue dialects. I'm more of a Northern China person, and but like. I wouldn't say no to an invitation, so that would be silly on my part. So I'm going to share with you some of my views on morphology of Cantonese. Sorry, not of Cantonese, or Yue dialects in general, particularly on Cantonese, compared to what happens in the rest of China, especially in the area I'm more familiar about, which is Northern China. So we'll first give a rough, very, very quick introduction on the idea of Chinese as an isolating language. What does it mean in practical terms to be classified as isolating? And I will compare the general situation of Sinitic with what happens in Yue dialects. And in the second part of the talk, I will shift my focus on a very peculiar phenomenon, which is very often unreported in the international literature, not in literature in Chinese, but in literature in English, yes, which is non-concatenative morphology, and highlighting some key differences between what happens in northern China and what happens in the Yue area. So, very, very quick overview of some basic facts. Of course, we know that Chinese, in the sense of Sinitic, of course, has a strong tendency towards having monosyllabic morphemes, and this has been even formulated as a rule in work by Fengshen Li, which basically says that in Chinese, a syllable must correspond to a morpheme, and by morpheme here, he actually means more specifically a native Chinese root morpheme, so not a suffix, not a loanwords. Of course, there are exceptions, but it's mostly loan words, like jita, like in Mandarin, or liemianzi. I don't know how to say this in English, sorry, like paihuai. And the system actually tends to, as we know, reject this type of polysyllabic morphemes by doing this operation, which I loosely define morphemization. You take a word like cafe in Mandarin, and then you have words like qingka, naika, binka. So basically, the one single syllable is taken as a morpheme. You do this in your dialects too, of course, but we'll talk about this later. And also, one of the effects of this stability of syllable and morpheme boundaries is that you tend to have no syllabification. So a word like Tiananmen stays Tiananmen. It doesn't get resyllabified as Tiananmen, as would be the case in many other languages. And if that happens, reduction of syllables and obliteration of syllable boundaries, it's usually, if we speak of Standard Mandarin, for morphemes whose meaning is bleached to the point that they're basically not morphemes, like higher for child, or sha for shama. So at that point where these r and m are really no longer morphemes, then you can just they can just get reduced. But because if a syllable has to correspond to a morpheme, then it would be they tend to be unstable. Of course, we know that if we look at the modern Mandarin lexicon, in the present stage of the language, the vast majority of words are polysyllabic, and specifically the disyllabic form is the most common. I did a quick search of what happens, for instance, in a dictionary of neologisms, of Chinese neologisms, this one specifically collects neologisms from the year 2000 to 2015. So you have about 5,400 items in the dictionary, and only 16 are monosyllabic. So basically, monosyllabic words in Mandarin are extremely, extremely rare, new monosyllabic words. So the lexicon is clearly going towards the dominance of disyllabic, or to a lesser extent, trisyllabic, trimorphemic words, and clearly the dominance of complex words, be they compounds or derived words, depending on the definition you give of this. And there are many reasons for this, for why words are like this, but one very important one, which will become even more important in connection to what happens in Yue dialects, is that there are also basically prosodic reasons for having these many disyllabic and trisyllabic words. The interaction between the typical, the prosodic features of syllables and sentences and morphology, word formation, is what the framework of prosodic morphology is about. It was initiated in the 90s by McCarthy and Prince. So what they say basically is that the small independent unit of prosody is called a yunlütze, a prosodic word, and this is relied in turn by a foot, a yinbo, and the rule, which the assumption is that the foot must be binary, either under syllabic or Moraic analysis. So either you have heavy syllables, like for instance with like pat, or you have syllables, for instance, with a long vowel like pa. This can be considered as heavy. So this one contains two moras, the little Greek m's, and in principle it can form a foot by itself. But if you have only light syllables, monomoraic syllables like pa, then you would need two syllables to form an independent unit of prosody. And another, yet third option is that you might have long, heavy syllables, but your language is not quantity sensitive, is not mora sensitive. So this is irrelevant to the formation of a foot. So you really need two syllables to form an independent unit. And we know that starting at least from the Middle Chinese stage, the minimal syllable in Chinese/Sinitic is monomoraic. It's short. And whereas in Old Chinese, we have evidence through reconstruction, of course, we do not have direct evidence that you could have much more complex and heavier syllable structures, and you could have monosyllabic bimoraic words. And indeed, the lexicon of Old Chinese, in one of the classical language, was dominated by monosyllabic words. For instance, like in representative works of classical Chinese, like the Analects, the Luyu, or the Menches, the Menzi, you have only a very, very tiny fraction of disyllabic words. So the vast majority of the words are monosyllabic. And as further evidence of that, you even have, as evidenced by Feng Li, you even have pairs of synonymous words in which one is the emphatic variant, which has two moras, and the regular variant has only one mora. As for instance, the reconstruction that you see here for this ruo and ru, which goes like na, so with a heavier syllable, or na with a shorter syllable. This being the emphatic form. With the simplification of syllable structures, especially in the coda part of the syllable, and the development of phonemic tones, Chinese lost the possibility of having monomoraic fit. So basically, this led to the establishment of the disyllabic foot in Chinese, at least in the mainstream Chinese tradition. So what we see from the written tradition, which of course, obscures much of the diversity which was present in the spoken languages. We know very little about, but at least in the written tradition, you see the establishment of what we can see from the written tradition is you see the establishment of a disyllabic foot and the syllabification of the lexicon, which was achieved mainly with the creation of a huge number of compound words made of two lexical morphemes. And at that stage, actually, you don't even talk about compounds, because you have pairs of constructions like the one you see in one, like yi chang, but also chang yi. So you see that you could have both orders, which tells you that this is not really something lexicalized, conventionalized. It's still a two-word, what functionally would call a two-word prosodic combination. So you put these words together just because you need a two-syllable structure for prosodic purposes, because otherwise it doesn't work in syntax. And with time, many of those became idiomatized, and then they became compound, as shown by the fact that in the modern language you only have this order. You don't get this one, right? This one specific order got conventionalized. So what happened is that, in theory, in principle, prosodic requirements are independent from morphological requirements. But what happens in practice, as McCarthy Prince pointed out, is that very often a word in word formation also corresponds to prosodic words. So you tend to have words which follow these prosodic requirements. So in modern standard Chinese, a standard foot, like the regular foot, the 标准音部, is disyllabic, whereas a monosyllabic foot is called a degenerated 退化音部, and it does not constitute a prosodic word in itself, and it comes with lots of restrictions. For instance, you don't have many monosyllabic utterances in modern Chinese. They are dispreferred. There are very, very few new monosyllabic words. You can have a trisyllabic foot, of course. This works fine, which is basically built. It's called the superfoot, a 超音部, which is basically built by adding a syllable to an already existing foot. Like 现代 becomes 现代化, or 代表 becomes 代表性. This type of construction. This is not the preferred word form, but it's entirely possible. So what does it mean when we say that Chinese Sinitic Sinitic languages are isolating? You know that this is like the usually when you have to give an example in a textbook of an isolating language, that would be definitely Chinese, whatever you mean by that, by the term. Well, and as you can see in this quote by Laurent Sagar, this is the idea that Chinese is like typical example of an isolating language is not applied only to Mandarin, to the standard language, but also generally to most modern Sinitic languages. And in practical terms, what does it mean for a language to be classified as isolating? How does this correlate, with other typological features of the language? Bickel and Nichols proposed a deconstruction of the idea of morphological types by proposing three logically independent parameters, for which any combination is possible. So it's like you can get the ideal types, but you also get mixed types. So in the ideal isolating type, if you look at the degree of fusion, you would have like isolating formatives. So grammatical meaning is expressed by three phonological words, whereas like the other options that you would have concatenative formative like affixes and clitics, or even nonlinear, non-concatenative formatives like segmental and suprasegmental modifications of the root. When it comes to flexivity, like how morphemes are realized, the two options would be having flexive formatives, which mean they come with allomorphs, they come in different shapes, or non-flexive formatives, which are invariant, like you get always the same shape for the same meaning. And of course, you would expect an isolating language to have non-flexive formatives. And when it comes to exponents, so the ratio between grammatical meaning and exponents and the physical, the concrete exponent of a category, the two options would be having cumulative exponents, so more than one grammatical meaning for a morph, or separative exponents, so one-to-one correspondence between category and morph. And an isolating language would have isolating formatives which are non-flexive and separative, ideally, in the ideal isolating type, although any combination is possible. And if those are the parameters, and if we look at the standard language, actually, yeah, you could say that Chinese, at least standard Mandarin, is very isolating in the sense that you have clearly defined morpheme boundaries, like we said. Morpheme and syllable have a strong correspondent. If you add an affix to a root, you would still know very easily where's the root and where's the affix. I mean, the borders are clearly defined. There is definitely no cumulative exponents, so no form that expresses two meanings, no variation, no flexivity, like the morphemes have only one shape. So generally speaking, yeah, you would say, yeah, it's definitely a very isolating language, a very prototypical example. Even when you have grammaticalized items, one of the best example would be probably the perfective asked marker le in Mandarin, which, as we know, comes from the grammaticalization and reduction of the verb liao, to finish, right? You see some kind of reduction, but still, even with this reduction, the morpheme Mandarins remain very stable, and this le appears in exactly the same shape in every word. So you don't have lots of you don't have allomorphy at all. and to what has been claimed to be a general property of grammaticalization in East and Middle and Southeast Asian languages, at least this is what Walter Bisang proposes, whereas you have grammaticalization without concomitant change in form, without concomitant reduction of form and meaning. And this has been stressed also specifically for Sinitic, not in general for the area, in a very often quoted paper by Ansaldo and Lim, where they stress, again, they stress the fact that syllable boundaries are very discrete, and there are some phonotactic constraints, like the one we mentioned before on resyllabification, that like they don't give you an easy, they don't give you an easy time if you want to reduce syllables. So this idea is very, very deeply entrenched in the typological literature. What happens in UA dialects? The general framework is, of course, very close to the rest, very similar to the rest of Sinitic. You tend to have, like again, monosyllabic morphemes. If you have polysyllabic morphemes, they belong to the same type as Mandarin. You have, of course, loanwords like sedobelei, like strawberry. You have lianmianzi, the same type that you find in Mandarin. And in a similar way, polysyllabic morphemes may undergo morphemization. The equivalent of cafe, gafe, it gets recast, for instance, as in words like zaifei, black coffee, right? It's just that it's not the first syllable, it's the second one, but it's the same principle, right? One difference, which is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about today, is that at least in Cantonese, there are no neutral tone syllables. So even functional morphemes, like for instance the perfective suffix zo, the more or less functional equivalent of le, still retains their tone. So you see that the shape of affixes of functional morphemes is in a way even more stable than in Mandarin, you could say, because they still retain their tone, so they still retain like more prosodic autonomy. And of course, as everybody knows in this room, generally speaking, like on the whole, monosyllabic words are more common than in Mandarin. There are many examples of like pairs of words in which the Cantonese version, for instance, is, I'm using Cantonese as an example, is monosyllabic and the Mandarin version is disyllabic. This is a fact that like very, very well known. One thing is that these can vary also depending on the layer of the lexicon, meaning that this tendency towards monosyllabism is really apparent more in native Cantonese words and not in the items, let's say, of Mandarin origin, which of course, like I use Mandarin in a loose sense because it basically just means that they come from the mainstream Northern Chinese tradition, which are more often disyllabic. So you would say, yes, that one feature that distinguishes at least the native layer of the lexicon is that there are more monosyllabic words. And this has been proved also like with actual figures, especially if you look at the basic vocabulary. Of course, if you look at the basic vocabulary, you're going to find less loanwords and more words which belong to the native stratum of the lexicon. There are several examples in the literature. For instance, Lee and colleagues in a relatively recent paper, they took a sample of about a little less than 700 items from the Mandarin list of the Leipzig-Jakarta word list project, and they showed that Mandarin has a monosyllabic to polysyllabic ratio of approximately 2 to 4, so approximately 1/3 monosyllabic to 1/3 polysyllabic, whereas for Cantonese that is 3 to 4, so you have many more monosyllabic words. And if you look at the top 100 words, so the most basic vocabulary, in Cantonese, the ratio is like 9 to 1. So it's really dominating in monosyllabic. In Mandarin, it's 7 to 3, so much less. Similar type of corpus, Liu and Lau. They look at the Swadesh list with 207 Cantonese vocabulary items, and they report that more than 90% of words and more than 97% of adjectives are monosyllabic. For nouns, it's a bit less, but still it's very, very, very high features. And what matters most in this connection is that monosyllabic words in Cantonese are not only inherited from previous stages of the language, they're still being created. So you can find examples of neologisms which are monosyllabic. And interestingly, even loanwords from English, polysyllabic words, they can be using Cantonese as monosyllabic loanwords. You have examples like email and interview, which have a monosyllabic version. Mandarin too has an asymmetry between verbs, which are more monosyllabic, and nouns, where you found more disyllabic items. However, the preference for monosyllabic items in verbs over nouns in Mandarin is true just for the old vocabulary or what they inherited. But if you look at neologisms, both words, verbs and nouns, any word class are dominantly disyllabic. Cantonese is different because we find also new words, new verbs, new adjectives, which are monosyllabic, and old words belonging to the native, old nouns, sorry, belonging to the native layer of the lexicon, which are monosyllabic. So it seems there is like really a fundamental difference in the typical shape of words. And an interesting fact in this connection is the prevalence of different types of compounds. This is a study, like a corpus study, like comparing a corpus of Mandarin, Cantonese, and Cantonese Chiyu words by Professor Tang. And he shows something very interesting, that the proportion of different types of compounds in the traditional classification is not that different for most categories, but it is very, very, very different for coordinating compounds. There is clearly a much, much greater share of coordinating compounds of Mandarin if compared to regular Cantonese, and even more if compared to these Chiyu Cantonese. So this difference is quite striking. And this is relevant in this connection because we know that in the mainstream Chinese tradition from which Mandarin originates from, coordinating compounds were often created precisely because they wanted to fulfill the disyllabic requirement for the prosodic word, which I mentioned before. So you have lots of compounds which are created of, I wouldn't say maybe synonymous, but quasi-synonymous morphemes like Kongji, Gongji, Jiandou, Shalo. So this, one of the reasons for the creation of these words apparently was just to fulfill this disyllabic requirement. And you see this very clearly. This is data quoted from Fan Li in the prevalence of coordinating compounds in different type of texts. So you have Confucius. So this is the Dialects. I don't know why he wrote Confucius, but this is the Dialects. Mencius and the Lunheng, a much later text. And you see that the proportion of coordinating compounds keeps growing to the point that in the Lunheng there are more than 2/3 of the total compounds. And the explanation one explanation that has been proposed for this is that, yeah, they were creating a lot of them for prosodic purposes. And actually, it has been pointed out in the literature that, for instance, by Massini, that until the 19th century, until the modernization of the Chinese lexicon, between 70 and 80% of disyllabic words were actually coordinating compounds. So apparently, it looks like Cantonese didn't feel the need to create these many coordinating compounds. And going back to prosodic requirements, for the mainstream Mandarin lexicon, these disyllabic requirements could be filled with the affixes zi and tou, which basically don't have much meaning. They have been defined dummy affixes. And again, we see that, for instance, in Cantonese, not in all of Yue, but at least in Cantonese, many Mandarin words with the zi suffix and with the tou suffix either don't have it, or they have it as they have an optional zi or tau, so ji and tau in Cantonese, of course. So again, it all looks like there was less of a requirement for something that was there only for prosodic purposes, only to create disyllabic words. So Cantonese, at least, not all of you, but at least Cantonese, seems to possess three features which deviate from the disyllabic template, which is very, very well established for Mandarin word formation and for many other Chinese dialects. Larger share of monosyllabic words, at least in the native layer of the lexicon, and the creation of new monosyllabic neologisms and monosyllabic loanwords, mainly from English. Less coordinating compounds, a smaller share of coordinating compounds, and less use of these dummy affixes for prosodic purposes. And an idea I have is that this might be related to higher sensitivities to moras, to syllable weight, because of course in Cantonese not only you have long vowels, but you also have these final consonants. And like something similar can be found, for instance, in Central Sinitic. This is like recent paper on Tunxi, a Hui variety of Anhui. And in Tunxi, you have this very, very peculiar phenomenon where personal pronouns have different forms. They have stronger forms, which are disyllabic. They have weaker forms, which are monosyllabic. And they have an intermediate version which is monosyllabic, but with a long vowel. So they're bimoraic. And in many contexts, you can use the bimoraic form as if it were the disyllabic form. So it can be prosodically independent. And just as in Cantonese, you have these pairs of words which are monosyllabic in the Tunxi dialect and disyllabic in Mandarin, like something like pan for huoban. But the difference is that this pan in Tunxi is a heavy syllable. So it's bimoraic. So it might be the case that, but the disyllabic foot is still preferred. So it might be the case that Cantonese does have the disyllabic requirement, but it's not as strong as in Mandarin because it can compensate with the use of like moras. As for non-concatenative morphology, this has been research on non-concatenative morphology has been performed mostly on Northern Sinitic, also because in Northern Sinitic it's easier to find and it's easier to spot. Let's say it's more obvious. And we know that there are many typological differences between Northern Sinitic and Southern Sinitic. It's like the two poles of Sinitic in a way. And when it comes to grammaticalization and to reduction of grammaticalized signs, there are three features which are particularly relevant in Northern Sinitic. The first is that Northern Sinitic is claimed to have stress. Of course, not everybody agrees on this. It's kind of a controversial topic, but still, it's more obvious than in Southern Sinitic. Like I said before, you have neutral tone syllables, so weakly stressed syllables, like for instance, the aspect markers and many functional words in Mandarin. And this is, again, not uncontroversial, but there is some degree of consensus on it. They are stress time languages. And we know that stress time languages tend to have more reduced unstressed syllables, which is exactly what happens in cases like liao becoming le or zhuo becoming zhe. Whereas Southern Sinitic languages, as Cantonese, tend to be more syllable times. They have the more tone registers, and like I said before, they don't have this neutral tone option. As for stress, again, there is no general agreement as to whether there is stress in Cantonese and Yue, but probably you can say it's safe to say it's not as prominent as in Northern Sinitic. So in Northern China, at least in a sub-area of Northern China around the Zhongyuan, the Central Plains regions, you find plenty of examples of morphology that in principle does not fit in the isolating template described before. It's not really what you would find in an isolating language, because you find like reduction, obliteration of morpheme boundaries, allomorphy, all these type of things which shouldn't be there in principle, in a way. There are several classic examples. This is, for instance, the Boshan dialect. It's a Mandarin dialect of Shandong, where you have different stages of reduction of grammatical morphemes. For instance, the equivalent of perfective le of Mandarin, or zhe, and many other functional morphemes get reduced to a monosyllabic suffix, which is represented conventionally with a schwa, but it's not an actual schwa. The shape of this suffix depends on that of the rhyme of the syllable it attaches to. So it can have different forms. Here you see just 3 examples, but there are many more depending on the rhyme. So you see basically not only strong reduction, but also allomorphy, flexivity, which is not expected in an isolating language. And even worse, in the same Boshan dialect, if this is getting replaced by dropping the suffix completely, this reduced suffix, and just using tone change as in this example, where perfective meaning is expressed by tone change, which of course is the case also for many UA dialects, as we will see in a moment. So you get non-concatenative exponents and cumulative exponents, because the root expresses both the meaning of the verb and the meaning of, and the perfective meaning. And this type of tone change with grammatical with P and dialog, tone change with a grammatical function, is said to be for Northern Sinitic an instance of what they call usually 清声字前变调. So like tone change before toneless syllables. So you add neutral tone syllables, have tone sandy, and then when the syllable disappears, all that is left is the tone change to express that grammatical meaning. Or even a related phenomenon, this is the Central Plains Mandarin dialect of Hanan, is called the Xunxian dialect. You have bian yun, rhyme change. So you don't have tone change, but you directly change the final of the syllable. Like in this case, mai, the verb by, becomes me in the perfective aspect. And again, you get flexivity because the shape of the change rhyme depends on that of the original rhyme of the verb. So you have different versions for that. So you have everything you shouldn't be expected to have in an isolating language. Allomorphy, non-concatenative exponents, cumulative exponents. So basically nothing fits in the stereotype. Well, there's also rotacization, but I'm not going to talk about this because it's not really relevant for you. But you can also use that with the same function. So what happens in this dialect, this is a line of grammaticalization specifically for perfective markers, but it can be applied to other types of grammatical markers because they all follow more or less the same pathway. So in the beginning, you have a verb, something like finish, which then becomes an auxiliary, and then an aspect particles like a clitic, like Mandarin le, and then a suffix, and then it can get reduced to a single vowel suffix, a very weak, very light suffix. And then it can go in many other ways, like it can be rhyme change, tone change, vowel lengthening. You have all sorts of outcomes, as we saw before. But what matters most in this case, and what is most relevant to the comparison with Yue, is that the starting point for all of this is tone neutralization. So it all starts when the grammatical morpheme loses its tone, and that kind of paves the way for further reduction for this 清声字前变调, this tone change before toneless syllables. It all starts with tone neutralization, which gives you the preconditions for reduction and fusion. What about Yue dialects? I'm quoting again from the same paper by Ansaldo and Lim, because it's one of the few that has engaged with the acoustic correlates of grammaticalization. And specifically, they analyze one construction of Cantonese, that is the verb go, to pass, when it's used as a marker of comparative, like I'm taller than you, that type of construction. So here it's a verb, and here it's more grammaticalized than a verb, obviously. It's a marker of comparison. And they measured the acoustic correlates of this type of grammaticalization. And what they tell you, yeah, there is some degree of erosion. You know, the vowel quality is a bit different. They're more centralized. They're shorter. Like, I mean, if you compare these two, I mean, like the grammaticalized one is shorter duration. It has lower pitch, lower fundamental frequency, lower intensity. So you get some correlates, but still, even in this case, it's not as advanced as to lead to like a blurring of the morpheme boundaries. It's still clearly perceived as a separate syllable, as a separate morpheme. But actually, we know that tonal morphology, or even fusion in some cases, may be found also in prototypical Southern Sinitic dialect, like Hakkamin and also Yue. What is probably one of the most often quoted cases in the literature is this phenomenon by which the perfecting morpheme zo and cognates in other Yue dialects gets reduced, gets basically left out, and there is tone change on the verb root. So this perfecting meaning is expressed by tone change. It's often described based on Cantonese, where it's maybe not really very prominent, not very common, but it is more common in other Yue dialects, especially in the let's say, less urbanized varieties, the varieties that are not spoken in major urban center. According to a recent paper by Hilary Chappell, there are more than 35 UA dialects which have this phenomenon. So it's really quite common. Okay, this is a classic example from like 香港粤语, so you don't need that. You really don't need that. You know what I'm talking about. So the second tone, 3-5 rising tone of zuo gets basically copied on the verb root. The problem is that, as you all know way better than me, this is kind of dying out in Hong Kong and probably also in Guangzhou. But it's not dying out, apparently, reportedly, in places like Shunde or Foshan, like in the less prominent urban centers. So there are part of UA part of UA dialects are still using it. But the process for which this is created must be definitely different from what we saw both for Northern Mandarin, because you don't have the neutral tone stage, which is crucial in this pathway. And if you actually look at the line of evolution for these perfective tone morphemes that Chappell proposes, you clearly see that something is missing, the part when the morpheme gets reduced. So it's like it's there, and then it's not there. More or less, this is how it's explained. At one point you have it, at one point you don't have it. There are no like intermediate stages. And when it's not there, what is left is again the tone change. Even Lamar and Ota in their typological study on this type of like non-concatenative morphology in Sinitic, they clearly point out that we know that in Yue Fan Yan we have something like that. We have like tone change, but they say like 虽然表面上语法功能相似，但其称声声交替的记着，包括变调和整个音系系统的关系，似乎相差的相当远。They're really different. That's what they say. And like they are kind of agnostic. They just say, oh, you know, 这是画方言比较研究的一个非常有趣的研究课题, but they don't provide an answer in that paper. And you also see that the effect of this is very different, because in Northern China you get a lot of stuff, you get a lot of different outcomes, whereas in Yue it's most of it is just tone change. So you see that something different is happening. Also, these phenomena in most Yue dialects, they tend to be like on their way towards obsolescence. Whereas in Northern Sinitic, they're still very vital and very like diverse. You get different manifestation of it. So the impression that you get from looking at this is that in Yue, this is kind of something that is already more mature, let's say older, like more like something that is on its way to like disappearance, whereas in Northern Sinitic you had this some more as an innovation. And again, while in Northern Sinitic you have lots of direct evidence, as in the case of Boshan, or indirect evidence by looking at the other dialects of all the stages in the process that I described above, you can find plenty of evidence for that. This evidence is lacking is mostly lacking, not entirely lacking, as we'll see in a moment for Yue. That in that you don't have this. You didn't have this direct evidence of a stage where the suffix was reduced or anything like that. So the existence of an intermediate stage in which a reduced form of the clitic or suffix undergoes coalescence with the verb may only be hypothesized, and I honestly think that there is no such intermediate stage. It's just that the suffix, after transferring its tone to the verb root, is just omitted in fast speech without necessarily getting reduced significantly, which might explain why you see tonal morphology, but you do not see stronger fusion, like rhyme change, bian-yun, or stuff like that, because that involves a stronger degree of co-articulation. So it does seem that the boundaries are quite strong. And the fact that aspect suffixes apparently retain their tone like zo and the rest, tells you that they're still prosodically quite strong, and so they might be expected to resist reduction, right? They can be omitted, this is fine, but without undergoing reduction first. So it seems that the processes at work are really a bit different. Although, actually, some indirect evidence, at least for tonal coalescence, may be found if you look at the early Cantonese sources. Particularly, this is data that comes from an article from the turn of the 20th century, which has been liked by Professor Go Bitsi, where they describe phenomena of tone change of Cantonese. So we are like really at the beginning of the 20th century, and what they show is that you have all these patterns by which verbs can have a changed tone, and if you look at it, you look at the red numbers, the last tone value in the sequence is always 5, so the highest tone. And here you clearly see that this high tone is an addition to the original tone. So you go from free 1 to free 1, 5. So like you added it on top of the existing tone. And independently from the original, from the citation form of the tone, at the end you always get something which has a 5 at the end. And these represent the omission of different types of spectral suffixes. Hue, which is like the grandfather of zo, like what you had before zo to mark perfective aspect, the to for continuous aspect, the zu for continuous aspect. So it tells you a nice story. It tells you there is a time where you could still feel, at least at the suprasegmental level, the addition of the suffix. But the part that doesn't quite fit is this one. Why would you have a low tone suffix triggering a high tone? That's kind of a problem. So as Professor Gok pointed out, you cannot say for sure that this case comes from tonal coalescence, but it might be also like an independent phenomenon, like tone change without necessarily having to do with the interaction with the previous suffix. Another thing that is kind of like tends to make Yue dialects look a bit like their northern relatives, their northern distant relatives, is that oh great, I'll hurry up. Sorry. Is that you have this not only the tone change to the second tone, to the rising tone for perfective, but apparently you can have it like also to substitute do and to substitute high, used as a resultative. So like you start from something which is again 5-5, 3-5, 3-5, and this gets copied on the verb root. For 3-5, you can say, okay, they just copied the tone of the grammatical morpheme on the root. But for dak, it's a bit different, right? Because it's not rising. So it looks like what matters is that the end point is a high tone. So again, you see the relevance of the high tone, and you see the fact that just as it happens in Northern Chinese, you can have the same pattern of change to express very different meanings. So in this case, this can be disambiguated only by the context, right? Because otherwise they would look the same. But as Professor Gok points out, native speakers have no problem like telling you what this means, like what this type of tone change means. And it's the same that you find, for instance, for Boshan, for the schwa suffix that I said before, or even like bianyun. It can be used to express like perfective aspect, continuous aspect, the same kind of meanings that you see here, with the same form, And lastly, actually some evidence even for segmental reduction and fusion of a grammatical morpheme may be found in Yue, especially in the Seyap varieties, where you get the plural. This is the Domen dialect, and you get the plural forms of personal pronouns with the addition of a syllable coda, tone change, and in some cases even the change in the rhyme, like this nei becoming something like nya, right? So it's something like that. And they suppose that it comes from the fusion of the, it has been proposed at least, it comes from the fusion of the pronoun with the word like wok, like home, because words like with this etymon, okay, I'll just go to the end. Word with this etymon are used for pluralization of morphemes in the rest of Semitic. So you really have loss of initial contents and contraction to a coda. But this is like, of course, marginal. So it gives you the feeling of something that is already already ironed out. What is interesting is that if you compare other C varieties, other Seiyap varieties like Hexiang Yayao, what you see is that you don't get these changes, these additions, segmental, but you get the same tone for the plural. So this became kind of a marker, it became kind of an established marker of plurality in pronouns, this particular tone contour. Okay, so I also want you to talk about this diminutive tone change, but obviously I don't have time for that. So I'll just jump to the conclusion. So while Cantonese word formation is also based on the syllable morpheme correspondence, and compounding is the main strategy to create new words if compared to standard Mandarin, Cantonese stands out for having more monosyllabic words and less devices for creating disyllabic words for prosodic purposes, as well as the possibility of creating monosyllabic neologisms and even monosyllabic loanwords. So the disyllabic preference is not as strong as Mandarin, which could be also due to greater sensitivity to moras. Second, despite claims to the contrary in the literature, like, for instance, Ansaldo and Lim, and even myself, actually, several patterns of non-concatenative morphology may be found not only in Northern Chinese, Mandarin, and Jin dialects, but also in Yue. However, most processes seem to be declining, while Northern Chinese seems to be in a less mature phase. While segmental changes in syllable rhymes are marginally attested, tone change appears to be by far the dominant pattern, further attesting to the greater stability of morpheme boundaries in Yue and generally in Southern Chinese if compared to Mandarin and Jin. So this again could be a sign of the fact that Yue is closer to the mainland Southeast Asian typology, as expected. However, the attestation of lengthened rhymes, both in Northern Semitic and Yue, with the addition of tone morphemes, while they originate probably from different processes, in a case you have 形成之前变调, in the other case you have this tone coalescence, it shows that syllable morpheme boundaries, even though they are stable at the segmental level, they may be blurred at the suprasegmental level. Lastly, the possibility that at least part of the tonal morphology of Yue dialects does not originate from coalescence, but is rather an independent phenomenon, it bears consideration, as for instance proposed in a recent paper by Professor Gok and Wu on diminutive sound change. Okay, does that say? Thank you very much.